Проблема!
In August 2024, Ukraine's 3rd Separate Assault Brigade launched an intense mechanized assault to break through the Russian front in the Kharkiv region, aiming to clear this Russian-held forest strongpoint, which was used as a staging area by a Russian force roughly 2.5 times the size of the Ukrainian assault force. The first phase of the assault began at exactly 5:20 a.m., when a Ukrainian tank fired the first round to soften up the Russian defensive lines. What followed was an intense barrage of heavy-caliber fire to suppress the enemy. Because of the Russians' numerical superiority, the brigade had an unprecedented level of support assets at its disposal to enable the attack. After the intense direct and indirect fire had pounded the forest, the tanks deployed smoke and withdrew, while the infantry advanced in armored personnel carriers. Meanwhile, the tank crews had one final message for the Russians. As they dismounted from their M113 armored personnel carriers into the unknown, Ukrainian soldiers weren't the only ones charging headfirst into the hornet's nest. Fighting alongside them were several foreign volunteers, including a former US Marine facing his first combat. But we'll come back to his story later. With the arrival of the infantry, the second phase of the assault finally began. What the men did not know at the time was that 2 days of straight-up hell lay ahead of them. The fighters were dropped straight into combat in the middle of a network of Russian dugouts and fighting positions concealed throughout the surrounding forest. The trees started shooting at them, and the men shot back. Less than a minute after dismounting, the Ukrainians had their first wounded. While his condition after being wounded remained unclear, one thing was certain: the battle-hardened men of the 3rd Assault Brigade were not going to let it shake their determination to carry out the attack. Spotting Russian soldiers and positions in the dense undergrowth was difficult from where they stood, so some of the men used the M1103's loading ramp as an elevated platform to get a better view of the terrain. It was a dangerous move, given the countless concealed angles from which a weapon could be aimed at the already bunched up Ukrainian troops. That left only one logical option: use the terrain to spread out, take up positions, and establish a foothold. Well, I guess those weren't the same medikits they would send to their Ukrainian comrades, or what do you think? Despite initial difficulties, the Ukrainians finally established a bridgehead. Then this happened. But just watch for yourself what he does here now. Although the fighting on the ground had temporarily quieted down, modern drone reconnaissance kept the battle going with deadly precision. Any enemy movement was immediately spotted and brought under fire. These two unfortunate Russian soldiers had the bad luck of being spotted in an open field. But no indirect fire was waiting for them. Instead, the Ukrainians deployed a different type of weapon. One we all know by now, and I think you can guess which one it is. The weapon was, of course, an FPV drone. Who would have guessed, right? However, I can only show the impact on Telegram. By 7:11 p.m., it was clear that the Ukrainians had managed to establish a permanent foothold in the Russian-held area. But the fighting was far from over. In fact, the real Sisyphean task was only just beginning. Establishing a foothold in the forest was only the first step toward enabling further operations in the area. The next day, the Ukrainians launched another mechanized assault, this time with the goal of clearing the forest completely of Russian forces. Before we continue, one small thing, don't forget to hit the like button and leave a comment. It really helps the video reach more people. The assault here was carried out as a preemptive measure, as the Russians had been using the forest as a staging area to gradually gather and conceal troops with the intention of launching offensive operations from the forest into the 3rd Assault Brigade's area of responsibility. This is a particularly effective approach, especially during the summer, for massing forces despite constant drone surveillance. The dense vegetation conceals the presence of the soldiers while simultaneously making the area difficult for an attacker to access. This was most likely also the reason why the M113s remained in the area for some time after the dismount, providing the soldiers with fire support from an elevated position with a better overview of the battlefield while helping to shape the terrain for an easier advance. The helmet camera worn by the former US Marine mentioned at the beginning illustrates just how chaotic the situation the Ukrainians had charged into really was. In the middle of a raging battle, fighting through difficult terrain filled with fortified positions, it can be extremely difficult to maintain your orientation. And when bullets are flying the entire time while you hear comrades to your left and right being wounded, it only adds to the stress. Luckily, the wounded could be brought into the M113s for further treatment under relative cover, followed by a rapid extraction. This is a luxury that, in the context of today's brutal drone-centric warfare, most soldiers no longer have, although the growing use of UGVs has led to some improvement in the otherwise dire CAS evac situation. After the wounded had been brought to safety and the drop-off area had been largely cleared, the men regrouped and continued their advance. Now the real work began. To secure the forest, the men had to clear a number of Russian dugouts and fighting positions against an enemy that was numerically superior to their own force. As a general rule, a numerically inferior force can effectively fight a larger enemy if it manages to isolate individual elements of that force. By doing so, it can create temporary local numerical superiority, allowing it to destroy the enemy piece by piece, rather than confronting its full strength all at once. This is typically achieved by making intelligent use of the terrain, cutting off enemy elements from one another, or fragmenting the main body through attacks at multiple points. Instead of fighting the entire force simultaneously, the objective is to turn one large battle into a series of smaller engagements in which the attacker can achieve local superiority despite being outnumbered overall. The Russians' dispersed positions, naturally isolated by the dense forest, helped the Ukrainians with this.
Что такое? Скалс! Живой? Скалс, как ты? Куда?
As the battle progressed, another Ukrainian soldier was wounded. His comrades immediately checked on him.
Скалс, ты как? Скалс!
По роже въебало.
По носу. Да, нормально так все.
Очки улетели.
По носу уебал.
Мне глаза болят.
По носу. Тут, перед стволом.
The injury appeared to be only minor, and he stayed in the fight. The Russians attempted to disrupt the Ukrainian assault with artillery fire, forcing the Ukrainians to temporarily take cover inside some of the cleared dugouts. To gather more intelligence on the enemy, the men came up with an idea. They simply captured one of the Russians' radios. They also questioned the Russian soldier about the enemy's troop strength. Although wounded, the Russian soldier provided valuable information.
Скільки у вас людей?
Там далі все є люди.
Скільки людей?
Більше роти.
Більше роти? Позиції, далі ваші позиції, да,
A
бліндажі йдуть.
substantially larger force than their own.
Скільки звідси метрів?
Понял.
Based on this new information, the men had to adjust their plan.
Чоловіки, коротше, сказали, що план зайти по балки.
Да.
Наше командування сказало, щоб ви робили фаєртіми і робили накати.
Накати?
Да, фаєртімами.
Вони будуть йти альфа-браво, ми заїдемо. Якщо там 300, помощь, откат, пацани зроблять накат, придвинуться трохи далі, якщо по можливості, ми будемо відтягувати типів. Плюс-плюс.
То ми, коротше, троє на цьому. На тяжкі.
Що, друже?
А?
Чуть перекур і в'йо.
The assault continued. Here we see the previously mentioned local superiority created through intelligent use of the terrain.
Окей, заходим в блиндаж.
Цей?
The Ukrainians assault a Russian position, rapidly overwhelming any potential resistance with speed and aggression before surrounding the position and clearing it with grenades. This is a standard operating procedure. Even seemingly empty positions are cleared the same way. Better safe than sorry.
Єбать. БК, да?
Давай в тот блиндаж залезь.
Whenever possible, the Ukrainians avoid storming covered dugouts directly.
Кидай гранату.
Instead, they prefer to use grenades whenever they can. The risk is simply too great. A position may have been booby-trapped, or a desperate Russian soldier may be lying in wait inside.
Простріли його нахуй! Хорош, все! На відтяжку і нехай дим вийде нахуй! Да, не пусть дим вийде нахуй!
In theory, these positions are designed to allow the defenders to move between them during combat. This gives them fallback positions during an attack or withdrawal.
СПшка вгорі!
Горі СП.
Давай туди на!
Той, да?
Да, давай! А? Да, дві СПшки!
Я крию, йди.
The objective is to maintain at least some mobility within the defensive line.
Проблема!
As a result, many positions are often left unoccupied. Of course, this may also simply be the result of a lack of manpower. In the end, however, every position has to be cleared as if it were occupied.
І два в той. Тут твоє назви.
The Russians intensified their indirect fire,
Щас духну його.
forcing the Ukrainians to take cover after a close call.
Чуть не кончився. Привіт, братан. Дуже радий тебе бачити.
They took shelter in a dugout.
Пацани, слушаем, що летить.
Вот, проебали, сука, из-за этого, блядь.
But the Russian fire was accurate.
Пацаны, сидели!
Єбать, він прицельно їбашив.
Сюда, зараз наступний буде сюди, я вам буду.
Єбать, воно в'їбало нахуй в цей бліндаж, що ти хотів залізти.
And just as the soldiers had predicted,
Вилазь! Та тихо, ба! Вилазь! Вилазь, ти пизда!
their position was hit, but the battle was far from over. The fighting continued into the night and beyond.
Та не бачу їх, я не чую.
According to the 3rd Assault Brigade, the operation ended in a Ukrainian victory. The brigade reported capturing a Russian battalion defensive area, along with multiple platoon and company-sized strong points. Ukrainian forces also penetrated nearly 2 square kilometers into the Russian defensive line. Around 300 Russian soldiers were KIA during the operation, alongside significant losses in enemy equipment and weapons.
Спортик, рух!
Meanwhile, the American and his squad came under heavy enemy fire and were pinned down near another Ukrainian squad. In an interview on the International Legion's YouTube channel, he later explained that the language barrier left him with very little concrete information about what was happening around him during the operation. However, judging by the footage and the men's behavior, it appears their advance was effectively halted by the Russians. The Ukrainians attempted to establish fire superiority, but apparently failed to do so immediately. As a result, they were forced to temporarily establish a defensive perimeter and slow the tempo of their assault. This is not unusual. Operations like these rarely unfold in one swift, uninterrupted push. In this particular case, a well-positioned Russian machine gunner managed to pin down the Ukrainians with a high volume of fire. It's interesting to see this here because, in most combat footage we cover, the roles are usually reversed. The Russian machine gunner appeared to be doing his job well and the situation remained unchanged for quite some time. Despite their relatively unfavorable position, the Ukrainians remained calm. They tried to return fire but had only limited success with this. Some of the rounds even fell extremely short, landing dangerously close to their own comrades. The dense vegetation severely restricted visibility. They also did not know the exact location of the Russian machine gunner. Combined with the volume of incoming fire, they were forced to fire almost exclusively from the prone position. As a result, it proved extremely difficult to establish an effective base of fire that would allow them to maneuver. As the battle continued, the American soldier, along with several of his international and Ukrainian comrades, was wounded and had to be evacuated from the battlefield. This, however, took place off camera.